All right, guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about maintenance phases. Um, so I've done a couple lectures now on TDEE, metabolic adaptation, and macros. So check those out if you haven't, because this is kind of going to reference those, but also build on it. And so today we'll basically get into what is maintenance, right? So we think scientifically, and then we think, well, how does it apply to us? What's the rationale for weight maintenance? Why do we need to use weight maintenance phases in between our bulks and cuts? Do we? That kind of seems like a waste of time to some people, but it could be really important. And then how to use them, right? So again, between bulks and cuts, I will give you a couple examples of how I periodize nutrition and how you can do it too, all within our app Log Smarter. So to start, what is weight maintenance? Well, when we look at the literature, there are probably a dozen different definitions. And clinically, some of the NIH, CDC guidelines recommend, weight regain. So once you lost weight, um, and generally the weight loss has to be 5 to 10%. Uh, but once you lose weight, not regaining more than 3 kilos in 2 years. And there's also a waist circumference measure that you can see on there. The Institute of Medicine says, you got to lose 5% of body weight, which, for a 200-pound male, that's what, 10 pounds? And you have to keep it off for at least a year. That's fair. And then one of my favorite kind of publications on this topic is from Stevens et al. 2005, and it says, weight change up to 3% after weight loss. And so this gives a little more idea of how we look at fluctuations, right? So when we step on the scale every day, you may see a plus or minus 1% change. And so you don't want to step on the scale and freak out and say, oh no, I'm not maintaining, I'm gaining or losing, based on kind of those acute data points. And so what we do at Log Smarter, and what I encourage everyone to do, is weigh yourself daily, or if not daily, as much as you can. And so then we get this nice data set, like you can see here. And again, this is from data from a previous lecture that I presented, so check those out. But you see my weight fluctuating across 2 weeks. And then, so if you took the average of the first 7 days, it would be right there. So we've got 165.08. And then if we take the average of the second week, we have 165.04. So not much change. I would call that weight maintenance, obviously. You will probably see more fluctuations than this. This is kind of very strict weigh-in guidelines, which there should be a video up by the time this goes up on how to weigh yourself. And this is just an example too. So you may fluctuate a lot more than this. And the reason those data points are so important is because if we only looked at, say, 3 data points across 2 weeks, and let's say we by happenstance, measured ourselves at 165.7, 166, and 166. So we're hitting all of the high numbers. We would end up weighing almost 166 pounds, right? If we did the opposite and only hit the low points, so maybe you weigh every day, but you don't put the data in. This is the old coaching trick. You can actually lower your average body weight. And you see our actual, or my actual, is 165.04, but if across these 2 weeks, depending on if I hit the high days or the low days, I could have a very different number. So at Log Smarter, we use rolling averages. So we'll take the previous 7 days. And then as you add a day, the last day falls off. And this helps to average out or smooth out those fluctuations that we see. And we see fluctuations due to a number of reasons. So we have water. So our body is 75% water. So hydration status plays a huge role in daily body weight. If you're dehydrated, it's going to be lower. If you're overhydrated, which just doesn't really happen that often, but you can be, you'll weigh more. Another thing is gut content, right? So if you eat something, say you eat 500 calories in vegetables, that's a lot, right? You probably wouldn't do that, but you could, and then you would have all of this stuff or food sitting in your gut, and that's going to weigh down, right? It's also going to track some water if you have extra water, so it's just going to kind of sit there and digest, slowly, but enough to affect your body weight the next day, especially. Now, if you always do that, well, that's okay. That fluctuation, you probably won't see it. And then lastly, we have sodium intake. So sodium makes everything taste better. A lot of people kind of are scared of sodium. Don't be necessarily scared of it, but know that when you have that pizza on Friday night, like I'm about to have, when you wake up the next morning, you're probably going to weigh more, right? That's because the food content, the salt holds that water that we're drinking, and it's going to make you weigh more. Something else to keep in mind, the larger you get or the larger you are, say a 200-pound male to a 110-pound female, they're probably going to have different weight fluctuations. I've seen guys fluctuate up to like 4 pounds up and down just based on what they're eating across, a couple weeks. Whereas females have, the menstrual cycle. You fluctuate throughout that, and you need to account for that. So now you know about weight fluctuations, kind of know how to weigh. So when do we maintain our body weight? Well, I think if you're new to training, so I'm specifically talking about resistance training, there's a kind of window of opportunity where you can go in, you can train hard. Maybe you don't even train that much. Maybe it's 3 days a week, maybe it's 4 days a week, but you can eat the same amount of calories and you can gain muscle. And so we call those newbie gains. Those can last quite a while. The first 2 years, you could probably get away with most of your increase in muscle mass. Also, again, check out the macro lecture because you're going to want to make sure your protein's on point, you have enough carbs, and you have enough fat to kind of fuel those gains. So we can stay the same body weight, and we can actually build muscle and lose fat at the same time. And this is known as body recomposition. It's kind of the holy grail. It definitely happens in naive people or newbies. When we get more advanced, it becomes really, really hard. And the science is kind of mixed. So you see it in some studies. There are some studies where people take layoffs, so like an athlete, right? If you finish your season, you have the summer off, maybe you don't train that much, or maybe you have the spring off and you come back for summer training, you can kind of lose some of that lean mass and gain it back. And that looks like body recomposition in a scientific study, but it might not actually be. You might just be coming back to baseline. So I would say, you can definitely do it if you're a beginner. If you are advanced or if you've been training for like probably 4+ years, and you know what you're doing, your progressive overload, your frequency, intensity are on point, you're probably not going to recomp very well or at all. But it is possible. Another time to maintain is after you've been dieting. And this is the next few slides are from my metabolic adaptation lecture. And here's what happens when you diet. There's a couple of studies that go up and down with food intake. So we're going to look at the metabolic adaptation up or down. So when we gain weight, we actually see an increase in metabolic rate. Right? So in this study, this Liebel et al., 1995, they gained 10% body weight, which is a lot. They then lost it, so they made the same as baseline. They lost another 10%, and then they lost another 10%. And so what happens is you see your metabolism kind of increase when you're on surplus, so when you're bulking. These people weren't resistance training, they were just eating. And then it kind of comes back down to baseline, and then you see during a deficit it decreases, and that's the metabolic adaptation that most people are worried about. But this study did have 2-week kind of settling points. And some other data. basically so let me back up for a second. But in 2015, there's another metabolic adaptation study where they overfed people by 50%. They then had, like 2-week maintenance, and they decreased their calories by 50%. These are mostly proof of concept studies, right? You're not going to increase your calories and then decrease your calories that much. Log Smarter's definitely not going to do that for you. But you can see how when you're in a surplus, your metabolism increases. When you're in a deficit, it decreases. And then when you go back to baseline, it kind of comes back up. So it's very plastic, right? It's moldable. It's like Play-Doh. But when we diet, we have to be very careful of this phenomenon known as body fat overshooting. And that's the susceptibility to regain lost weight and more of that be fat mass than previously. So if you could follow my pointer, you have this nice 5 to 10% body weight loss, and then you see a kind of end diet point, and then they start, generally people regain most of their weight in the next year or two, and their body weight's higher. They see small fat-free mass decreases depending on the deficit and the protein content, things like that. Most of it generally is from fat mass, right? But you end up having people gain more fat mass, and this is due to hyperphagia, which is the drive to eat more. Now again, a lot of these studies on this concept and metabolic adaptation are not in people who are resistance training, who are moving, who are young and active. These are generally sedentary, overweight, obese participants. So you have some opportunity to kind of use that to your advantage and say, I'm going to maintain in between diets because I want to fend off this metabolic adaptation, this hyperphagia later, and work on my training more so. So again, we can maintain after a diet. I encourage it. It takes a long time to figure out how many calories and how you're going to feel when you're training and go about your daily life after you diet. So Log Smarter will take you down, right? You can then change from, you start a new log, change to a maintenance phase and take maintenance. I would recommend at least 4 weeks. Longer is more beneficial, although I know some people are a little impatient, and that's understandable. So, try to get at least a month of maintenance so we can get some good data for you, and then advise from there. Maybe you want to stay maintenance for the summer, right? You dieted down for the summer, got shredded, and then fall comes, and you're like, okay, it's getting cold, I got to put more clothes on, I'm going to bulk. And so you switch over to the bulk option. But that gap, that 3-month gap or whatever it is, you are maintaining. So that's something that I've seen with a lot of clients, and something that I kind of recommend is, you can use seasons to your advantage, especially if you're in college. Now the opposite also holds true. So after you've been bulking, you're eating all this food, your weight's kind of fluctuating up and down, you need to figure out how this maintenance is going to affect your life, your movement, your training, everything involved, right? Because A, don't bulk without resistance training quite a bit. But B, it's sometimes hard to eat a lot. And then you get used to it, and then you're like, oh, okay, I got to take away 300 calories. Well, maybe that's not so bad. But if you had to bulk with an extra 500 or 600 calories, well, that's like a whole meal. So it's good to kind of settle in, again, take a couple weeks, at least 4, and transition slowly. So after your bulk, if it's a long bulk, you may have gained some muscle. Hopefully you gain some muscle. This is not a huge calorie kind of burner like most people think. It's about 15 calories a pound, I want to say, if I remember correctly. So you're not going to gain a bunch of muscle, your metabolism is not going to shoot through the roof. But again, you need to adjust to this new body that you have. Your physical activity might decrease. You might pull some of that food out, and you might walk around less. You might be more or less likely to go for a bike ride on the weekend or go hiking or something. Probably not, but you have to keep those things in mind. And then you also have different weight fluctuations. So you're pulling some of that food out, so all of those body weight fluctuations that I talked about still apply. Okay, so nutrition periodization. We have guidelines in Log Smarter on how to periodize nutrition. This is not set in our system yet. I think at some point it will be. As of this recording, it's not. I have a very long Medium article. If you want to read, if you're like a reader, you can go into in depth into why you want to periodize your nutrition and how. I think in the past probably year, I've started to change my mind a little bit scientifically, looking at studies, reading, writing, doing studies, to say we should really use maintenance phases. And so this is kind of an older slide, but concept still stands. You have a diet, you end your diet, you then use that 4-week or more maintenance cycle, and then you go into a nice long bulk. You want to bulk over, like, look at this timeline. This is a very long timeline. You generally want to spend more time in a surplus than in a deficit, and you fill in the gaps with maintenance phases essentially. Or if you happen to reach your like ideal body, like, you don't have to keep going. You can settle seems like a terrible word here. You can embrace that you've achieved your goal and just stay there. That's totally okay. Most people won't do that, but if you have that power, I encourage you to use it. And then, after your surplus, you maintain, and then you go into your next diet. And the dots right here, so you can see you're heavier. This would indicate you've gained some muscle over your surplus. And if you're a competitor, maybe you have some kind of competition recovery for physique athletes, bodybuilders, bikini, figure, etc., where they actually need to gain weight really quickly to get back to normal. But you, as a non-physique athlete, don't need to do that. You just need to kind of end your diet and settle in. Now, if you're nervous, I see this a lot. If you're nervous about gaining weight, you can use maintenance phases throughout your bulk, and they can actually extend your bulk quite a bit. So you have a nice 4 weeks. Maybe you bulk for 2 months, 8 weeks, right? And then you go back into a maintenance phase. You're like, I need to get used to this body. My training's good. I've put on 5 pounds, but I'm starting to feel it. It's not a lot of weight, but it's maybe your clothes fit differently, and you're like, I need to just settle in for a second. Then you kind of repeat the process. And this is something that I use, and I kind of tell people this is probably the best option. So that's just a brief look at how you could periodize things. There are 100,000 different ways to do this. This is just a couple of them. So, in summary, weight maintenance is going to be, in our terms, not scientifically, but in our terms, about a 0.5 to 1% fluctuation in body weight. That's how Log Smarter is going to track that. Now, when we look at the rationale, it's for just adapting. Your body needs to adapt to not gaining or not losing, as I described in the videos. And the metabolic adaptation video goes into a lot more detail if you're that kind of person. And then, we can use these to our advantage. You can use them in a lot of different ways. So, again, you have some flexibility here when you're dieting or bulking. And if you have any questions, shoot me an email, robertsb21@gmail.com. I am also active on Instagram, lots of infographics and stuff. Twitter, not as much. Facebook, you can look me up there. But go ahead and shoot me your questions if you have them. I'm happy to answer them. And